One to One, un mano a mano exclusivo con Joseph Stiglitz, economista, profesor de la Universidad de Columbia y Premio Nobel de Economía. Una entrevista realizada por Alex Milberg, publisher y director general de Forbes Argentina.
Professor Stiglitz, thank you very much for this interview with Forbes Argentina. It's an honor to receive you and share your ideas with our audience. The first question is, you have a very active participation in the last negotiation, defending the interest of Argentina. But before I speak of that, please could you briefly tell us your personal history with our country?
Oh, I've been going to Argentina for a very long time. I can't remember the first time. It was in the 70s. So I've been going back and forth. Love your country. And I got obviously very particularly involved with Argentina when I was chief economist of the World Bank. And it was in the period 97 to 2000. And it was very clear at that time, you were heading for a crisis. And I did what I could to try to make sure it was well managed, that it turned out very bad. It turned out as bad as I thought it was going to be. And then, of course, in the succeeding years, I got very involved with the debt restructuring in 2001, trying to get help in any way I could with the recovery of Argentina. Involved a lot in issues of the debt restructuring. Argentina played some role in my book, Globalization and Its Discontents, highlighting in a way the dangers of misguided advice, misguided policy coming from, at that time, the IMF. And one of the things I think that the recent negotiations have shown is that there's a new institution now. It has changed. Whether my criticisms over 20 years helped move it along, I can't say, but I am pleased that it has changed, at least for now, in a very positive direction. And very pleased that the new head of the IMF defines herself as the first head from an emerging market. Very pleased with the very constructive role that they played in moving the discussions along, supporting Argentina's analysis of debt sustainability, recognizing that austerity is never a solution. So you might say that's the history. And over the last 25 years, beginning with my time at the World Bank, I've remained very, very engaged with Argentina. And then I had the good fortune of having Martin Guzman work with me, first as a postdoc, then as a colleague, a research fellow, a collaborator, a co-author, and a co-author on a whole range of topics, some very theoretical, but perhaps most relevant to the situation in Argentina today. We did a lot of work on the analysis of debt crises and of debt restructuring. So never has a government been as lucky of having a finance minister in charge of debt restructuring who knew as much as your finance minister. He is really the world's expert on the subject, and he brought to bear that knowledge. But it was not only knowledge, he brought together together with a lot of wisdom and a Zen-like calmness that in the face of, what I've said on the part of some of the creditors, some very bad behavior on the part of creditors, but just kept his eye on the ball, what needed to be done, and got it done.
And you say that, of course, Martin Guzman is a young and respected academic, very respected, but landing from theory to the real practice, and is usually not easy. Perhaps you experienced something similar when you were an advisor to Bill Clinton. Could you give Martin Guzman advice at the time before to start?
Yeah, we talked a lot about that kind of issue of moving from academia into government in the way that I had done, both in going into the Clinton administration and then going into the World Bank. And those are two very different institutions, the US government and the World Bank. So I had and because at the World Bank, I could see many different governments, I was able to share with him a lot of experiences of to put it euphemistically, the challenges of moving from academia into government. Now,
and there is a golden advice. There is a golden advice to him.
Well, there was, you can say, some advice. Martin had gotten a little sample, because he was also involved doing a lot of work on debt restructuring with the UN. So it's not like working for a government or the World Bank, but it's a public body, and he was very active in trying to get the UN to adopt a set of principles for debt restructuring. And so he worked very closely with governments, and so it wasn't a total jump from doing mathematics into the policy arena.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
One of the reasons why we were attracted to each other was that our range of interest coincided. I've always been I began as a mathematical economist, as a theorist, and he did too.
You did it well.
What?
You did it well.
Yeah. But I entered academia because I wanted to do something for the world, and he did too. So we had a lot in common, and it's been a very fruitful collaboration. I do hope I could share some of my experiences with him.
The main mission of the Minister Guzman was to close a sustainable agreement for Argentina. And that mission took time, but it was accomplished. So Guzman better than most Argentinians. Could you tell us what are the main virtues as a Minister of Economy during this difficult time that maybe Guzman will have in the future after the debt is closed?
Well, you see, he wanted an agreement, but he also wanted an agreement that was good for Argentina and was sustainable. So you could have gotten an agreement earlier, but it would not have been as good for Argentina. And he was absolutely steadfast that he would not sign an agreement. He would not agree to an agreement that was not good for Argentina. It was not sustainable. He would not agree to an agreement that was kicking the can down the road. The world has a lot of uncertainty, but the least you could do is say with a reasonable degree of confidence that it's going to be something that's going to work. Now, of course, in the midst of all of this, the pandemic has made it even more difficult. But I think, one of the reasons he was so successful was that he brought to the table this clear commitment to making sure, and the reason he went back to Argentina is because of his love of the country. He had something that I had when I was in the White House that made others, it was difficult for others to understand. I had no personal ambition. I left the best job in the world, which is being a professor. And, if things didn't turn out, I'd go back to the best job in the world, which is being a professor. So in the meantime, I was going to do what I could to do the right thing, address poverty, inequality, make the economy more competitive, more efficient. And he brought that same kind of a commitment to Argentina. And I think that helps a lot, so you laser focus on, you have the security of being an academic, but the only ambition then is helping your country.
Yes. The question was, is after the debt close, the agreement, the new challenge for Martín Guzmán is to start to be an economy minister of the country with the huge trouble that we have beyond the debt. So that question was, is the new challenge start right now? And
exactly, and he knew that. This was just to begin. He still has a debt issue with a large amount of debt with the IMF. There are many reforms in the Argentinian economy, and then you're hit with a pandemic and all the economic aftermath of the pandemic. And you might say the US is setting an example of what not to do. You have an example of what bad leadership can result in, and that may inspire people all over the world to say, that's one extreme. You have good examples like New Zealand, both in terms of pandemic policy and economic policy. So, Argentina, seeing the really bad examples and the really good examples, is trying to be one of the good examples. And so, in starting with as you said, a lot of problems inherited from the past, and those are difficult issues to navigate because most of them involve special interest groups, navigating through them, difficult politics. And I think one of the things that Fernandez did very well and Guzman did well is getting the whole country behind the process. And using this as an occasion to try to increase national solidarity. And I think that helped in the negotiations a lot because everybody, a standard is divide and conquer, try to show dissension. And you give a lot of credit to the government of trying to, in a country that's all been politically very divided, you're not going to eliminate those divisions, but at least for the moment, you can get the country working together.
We hope so. You know that the last 60 years, we have only 5 with fiscal surplus. The other 55, we have a deficit in our accounts. What do you think that Martín Guzmán in this new stage as economy minister will be able to convince President and Vice President Fernandez to break this habit that we have?
Well, let me say, the issue is more complicated than it would normally be, both because of going from a very, very negative position to zero is really hard. You can go from very negative to less negative, but going to positive is a real challenge. And then that would have been hard. And on top of that is the pandemic, and it's a global pandemic. If it were just Argentina, that would be one thing. But it's because it's a global pandemic, it's going to affect your exports, it could affect inward investment. The world is on hold. So I don't think it would be wise for anybody in the midst of this pandemic, the duration of which we do not know how long it's going to last, to make any clear forecast. All that you can say is, let's do what you can, step by step, to make things better, to make things preparing for the post-pandemic world, so that when we get into that post-pandemic world, Argentina will be on firmer foundations.
Clear. Professor, are you happy with the agreement of Argentina, or do you consider that, and let me quote you, the recalcitrant, short-sighted, and hard-headed and hard-earned private creditors finally got away with them?
Well, what I said was that I think they were short-sighted. I think they were hard-headed and hard-hearted. If they had been more reasonable, the agreement could have been reached a long time ago. In fact, as you know, as the negotiations were going on, the economic conditions deteriorated. And you can always do better when things are better. So it was very short-sighted. It's also short-sighted not to ignore sustainability conditions. And the IMF made it very clear. It was a very peculiar negotiations in some ways, because Argentina laid out the economic parameters very transparently. It presented the analysis. Never, as far as I know, did the creditors come back with an argument. They never came back and said, your analysis is wrong. Here's the right way to think about it. You know, here's what you should be using in your analysis. They didn't even try to counter the analysis of the Argentina. And of course, not a surprise, because Argentina's analysis was supported by the IMF. So normally the country says something and then the creditors come back and say, you know, you don't understand. We're the experts. We know about this. And they argue. This time, they knew that they couldn't, they had no legs to stand on. And the only thing they could say is, we want more. And I kept saying, you can't squeeze water out of a stone. I struggled to understand why they were so short-sighted, so hard-headed, hard-hearted. One of the arguments I always thought is it exposed their lack of judgment in making the loans just a few years ago. And that must have been very embarrassing for them. And people don't want to admit a mistake. And I think that must have played a role in in the debate. They were saying, we were really foolish in making those loans just, was it 3 or 4 years ago? Not 2015. We're supposed to be the experts. We obviously are not. So they're not going to admit that. So obviously they're going to try to shift blame to others.
Hans Hume from Greycall said that he was surprised with the behavior of Blackrock. He said they were really tough. And he said maybe because there is a new people there, they don't understand countries like Argentina. That could be a possibility. But I don't know if you agree.
Well, no, they have a lot, these are large companies that can hire the best expertise in the world. They should be able to. It's $1 trillion management, multi-trillion-dollar. So I think and I do know they do have some experts, but not necessarily engaged in the bargaining at certain times. In the end, a deal was done. So I don't want to, but there was no reason it should have taken so long. The first offer BlackRock made at a reasonable interest rate. They discount things at 10%, and that really is not a reasonable interest rate. And I've written in criticism of that. If you used a reasonable interest rate, the original offer was that Argentina should pay them 20 cents on the dollar. So it's not a debt forgiveness. It was you're having some problems. Well, we'll charge you some extra interest for you to postpone your statement. We'll charge you some real usury. So it wasn't a deal that they offered originally. So it was really putting your head in the sand when the pandemic was raging, when Argentina had gone through a crisis itself. It's hard to forgive that in a way. One of the interesting things about this whole episode, in the very beginning, Argentina, a lot of the press began by saying, you've probably read it yourself, the 9th default of Argentina. By the end, the press coverage was almost universally on Argentina's side. Just a couple of weeks ago, the New York Times had just a wonderful article in support of Argentina and against BlackRock. Bloomberg, which is not usually, it's a financial press, very strong article in favor of Argentina. So, and that's also a tribute to Martin, that he could speak to them in a way they could understand, and explain things, and they listened, they made judgments. The reporters, as you know, your job is to listen to different views, and they all came out on the side of, these leading came out on the side of Argentina. I think that must have helped a lot.
Mm-hmm. Last week, Professor, you wrote in the Guardian that more than 100 low and middle income countries will have to pay billionaire debt, and many of them will be forced to default. Also, you consider that there is a systematic failure in numerous debt restructuring. And part of your proposal in the article, and you did already, is to establish a sovereign debt repurchase program. Can you explain the three bases of your plan on the proposal that you have to change this framework at the time to restructuring debts?
Yeah. So the basic idea, what I've argued for a long time is that we need a sovereign debt restructuring framework mechanism. Just like you have bankruptcy courts in most countries, there's no international bankruptcy court. We need, if the debt had gone to a bankruptcy court, it would have been settled very quickly, and we would not, you would not have had this protracted, negotiation. So that would have been a lot better, but that's not going to be achieved in the short run. So this is just several ideas I put forward. And that idea was that the bonds are trading, in the case of Argentina, it was like 30 cents on the dollar. There are cases like Bolivia a number of years ago where it was like 6 cents on the dollar. So if you buy up the bonds, some of them, through an auction, through some mechanism, it means that for 30 cents on the dollar, you relieve the government's debt burden. So it's like a debt restructuring, but it's a market-based mechanism. So that was the idea, that you don't have to go through this complicated negotiation. You can relieve at least a significant fraction, not all of it, but a significant fraction of the debt burden. So it would be a way of the IMF and donors to basically say to a country, I can relieve your debt burden for a fraction of the cost. And in the past, something like that's been done, but on much less favorable terms, because typically when the IMF lends money to the country, a lot of that money provides foreign exchange, which goes to the private creditors. So they get out with 100 cents on the dollar. And this would mean that you get 30 cents on the dollar. So it's a good buy.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But and your proposal, I mean, for it to be successful, it will need the backing off of the American Treasury, because otherwise it's difficult that the MIF can finally accept that proposal. What incentives would the Treasury have to give away power in favor of the MIF?
Well, I think you have to go back for the 70 years since World War II, 75 years. The US has consistently, until the Trump administration, believed that multilateralism is the right way to promote democracy and market economies. So our values, we believe, can best be supported through multilateralism. Now, we've had an unpleasant interlude with the Trump administration, which does not believe in multilateralism. But I believe that we will, in November, restore multilateralism. So the basic idea is that we're only one country among many. We have many collective problems that the world has to solve, like global warming, like the pandemic, and like global growth and the alleviation of poverty. And we do it better when we do it collectively, cooperatively. And so that is the objective. You can say there's an element of altruism. You know, there's a lot of altruism. We help each other. So I don't want, but it's not just altruism. It is really a belief that a prosperous emerging market is good for the United States. And a
you think that it would be possible Under Biden, do you think that your proposal would be possible under Biden administration?
Yes.
But
Yes.
what about if Larry Fink is as a potential Treasury Secretary? If Larry Fink finally goes to the Biden, do you think that it could be easy to accept that proposal?
I think that, we'll have to see what the election looks like. If the Democrats, including the progressive Democrats, get enough strength in Congress, there will be a commitment not only to multilateralism, but to progressive multilateralism. So the issue is, and even people who are not progressive realize that we all benefit from a stronger global economy. You're not going to have a strong global economy if large numbers of countries are facing crises. And then the only question is, what is the best way to face these crises? What is the best way to engage in debt restructuring? What is the role of the special drawing rights versus other proposals that are on the table? So I don't want to say that my proposal, that proposal is the only one or even the best one. I just think that the issue of debt restructuring is very important for many countries, very important for the world, very important for the United States, and that we have to be engaged in a serious debate about what is the best way of handling it. And it may turn out, people say, well, if we just issue enough special drawing rights, that will solve the problem. That's fine with me. But we can't bury our head in the sand again and pretend it's not a problem.
Mm-hmm. And Professor, what do you think some consider that your proposal could destroy the international capital markets?
Well, I think that's a silly point. The real point is that orderly financial markets are better than disorderly financial markets. And all of the proposals that I've been working on are trying to say, let's find as I said before, you can't squeeze water out of a stone. There's going to be debt restructuring. And let's try to find ways of doing that as smoothly as possible and as orderly as possible. So one way of doing it is market mechanisms. That was the one. Another way is an international bankruptcy court. But there are a couple of other proposals on the table. But what I do insist on is the current way, the law of the jungle, is not very good. And in this case, it worked out, but that's because there was a very good negotiator on the part of Argentina. In other cases, we know history, half of all debt negotiations turn out to have another crisis in a relatively short period of time. So it's too little and too late. So we know that the system as a whole is not working. And that's what I've been trying to fix.
Mm-hmm. And Professor, back in March, you said that the V-shaped recovery is probably a fantasy. How do you evaluate the impact of this huge crisis in the US, in Europe, and in Latin America?
Well, you can't separate out fully the management of the pandemic from the management of the economy. Countries like Korea and New Zealand that were very good in getting the pandemic under control managed, of course, to get the economy in better shape, relatively better shape. Not a surprise, the United States was the worst in managing the pandemic, but also the worst in managing the economic consequences. The increase in the unemployment was the worst in the world. So it shows you, if you have bad leadership, it's consistent. It's consistently bad. It was bad in health and it was bad in economics. And so to me, you could go through what specific measures went wrong. A very good article in New York Times the last few days about what exactly did they do wrong. On the health side, and I've written a lot about what are the specific mistakes they made in each of their programs, the failure to make a commitment to unemployment insurance, which we're dealing with now, the badly designed PPP program for helping small businesses didn't work, badly designed, badly administered. So what you see, I mean, the crisis is really illustrated, as I said before, a full range of competencies from really good government to really bad government. And the correlation between that and the consequences, unfortunately, is really high.
Do you consider that after this mess, President Trump still has very good chances to win in November, or beyond your desire, what do you think about the possibility?
I try to think about this objectively.
And why? This is the question. And why he still has chances?
Well, so I think most Americans think he's done a terrible job. But there are two problems. One, the Republicans are engaged in massive voter suppression, massive attempting to make sure this is not a fair election. The way they're, even to the point of making sure that there's no funding for the post office so that the mail-in ballots may not be able to work. Undermining the electoral process. So even if a vast majority of Americans support Trump, we are at risk. It's the first time we've ever said in a systematic way democracy is in the United States is being undermined. The second is that he has a loyal following. 30%, we don't know exactly how many. Understandable in some ways. And by that I mean neoliberalism led to the neglect of certain groups. The belief of trickle-down economics led to neglect of certain groups. And there are other elements that are often discussed. I think, there's an element of racism in the United States. It's not the dominant. You saw the dominant ethos in America. It was the Black Lives Matter, the enormous uprising across the country in support of justice, racial, economic opportunity. But the politics in that way in America is very polarized. So those are the two issues with which we have to contend. In the end, I'm optimistic that Vice President Biden will prevail.
Professor, do you consider that it is a time of rapture towards a new and progressive capitalism? I mean, this specific time, this huge crisis, is the beginning of something real new? Yes,
I do. Now, is it evolutionary, revolutionary? The way I would articulate it is, and this is the last question because I do have to go in just a minute.
Yes.
Vice President Biden was put on the Obama ticket to reflect the progressives. He is now viewed as very much the centrist. The country has moved in a much more progressive way. Concerns about competition policy, racial justice, economic justice, health opportunity, access to healthcare, educational opportunity. Those have all become mainstream. So the word progressive has become almost much of the agenda of the progressive is now at the center of the country. And of course, that's a good thing. So that's why I'm very optimistic. The way it gets done may be more conservative than the more radical people hope, but it will get done. Access to healthcare for all, access to education, eliminating, doing something about the voter suppression, the democracy issues, the corruption issues, the environmental green agenda, the discrimination, the gender issues. All of those, I think, are front and center in the mainstream of America. And I think Vice President Biden will reflect those.
Professor, thank you very much for this interview with Forbes Argentina. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you. Great.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.